Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from in North America. We're thrilled to have you here today to join us. My name is Rachel Arizmendi, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, our first webinar in January 2025 that we have entitled Building Economic Stability Amid Uncertainty. And as always, we're thankful for our partnership with UCLA Anderson Forecast to join us on this Avenue Insights webinar today. And joining us on this panel are these amazing experts in economics. We have William Yu, who is economist from UCLA Anderson Forecast. And we're so excited to have his expertise here today. He is a Master Business Analytics program at UCLA, and he works also in Harvard Extension. He has published dozens of research articles and is a distinguished awardee for digital technology. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Yu.
Thank you so much for having me.
We also have Mark Bryson with us today. He leverages over 35 years of experience in both economic analysis and accounting for government agencies. For the past 10 years, Mark has been with us here at Avenue Insights and Analytics, and he captures various regional data and trends for the entire state of California. Thank you, Mark.
I'm honored to join you all today.
And last but not least is Fran Mancia, our advisory board member at Avenue Insights and Analytics. And he has such a wealth of experience in the legislative and government relations work, both at the state and the federal levels for economy and policy. And Fran's advocacy efforts were instrumental, especially here in California, protecting state and local tax revenues. So we are thankful to have his expertise also on this panel today.
Thank you, Rochelle.
And Fran, if you could just start us off with a few words about where we are today and maybe a little bit about our partnership also with UCLA.
Sure. Thank you, Rochelle. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with my esteemed colleagues. I've had the pleasure of working on these presentations together many times, and it's just a pleasure to be here. The partnership with UCLA is particularly important to us at Avenue. We collaborate, with their beautiful expertise on macroeconomics. The Avenue side tends to be more of the micro, building from the bottom up. So bringing the two together, I think, works extremely well. And I think it's really important to get these different perspectives, especially in these uncertain times. We have a lot of change and unique circumstances in how we look at revenues and our forecast for economics. It's not just data-driven any longer. We now have to look at other things that were more qualitative that were never really in our conversations in the past, whether it's around climate change or the cost of insurance or things of this nature. We have a lot of changes going on in terms of world events, political events that have to be factored into economic forecasting. And I think we'll delve into quite a bit of that today. So just briefly, thank you again for having us, and look forward to the conversation today. And back to you, Rochelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. We have so much to cover today, from GDP to interest rates, possible impact of tariffs, rising costs of goods and services, impact of AI and robotics. So I'd love for us to get started. For more information about our panelists, feel free to visit our website at Avenue Insights and Analytics, and/or your informational notification about today's webinar. You can learn a lot more about the background of our panelists. And we're really excited because, this truly is a transformative time. Whether you're considering what's happening at the local level with our new administration, and also at the local level, especially what we're seeing here in California and how wildfires may be impacting climate change, may be impacting you at the local level. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And I would love to invite to our proverbial microphone, Dr. Yu.
Thank you, Rochelle. Hello, everyone. So I'm glad to be here. So let's get started with these slides. So in this slide, I show you the percentage of change of the real GDP since 2013 for G7 countries. And you can see in this chart, the blue thick line is the United States. So basically, since 2013, we had a very, very good GDP accumulated growth compared to other developed countries. And the black line is the world, including a lot of emerging countries, but we are not far behind. So basically, we are doing very well in terms of economic growth. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah, and we just look at the recent 2 years. So this is GDP growth. We can see, for example, in the past 2 quarters, Q2 and Q3, we had almost 3% GDP growth. And based on the preliminary data, the Q4 GDP growth will be very similar. So it's very good. So our recent GDP growth data remain robust. All right, next. So right now, people are asking, so why we had this so strong GDP economic growth, even we had this kind of rising interest rate over the past 2 years. And even a lot of us are talking about it might be some kind of recession coming or soft landing. We haven't seen that yet. So here I would like to show you some kind of breakdown of contribution of the GDP growth. So on the left, this is the breakdown of the contribution to the GDP growth over the past 2 decades before the COVID-19, because COVID 2020, 2021 is very unusual. So you can see there are several colors. The blue color is the contribution of the GDP growth to the GDP growth coming from private consumption, and the yellow color is coming from private investment, and the green color is coming from government spending, including the government investment. And the red, orange color is the contribution from net export, meaning exports minus in imports. And usually this net exports, usually in the United States, is negative because we run the trade deficit. So actually it will become the negative contribution to our GDP growth, because when we import, when we consume something, when we invest something made in other countries, that actually should be deducted from our GDP growth. So basically, we can see this kind of dynamic over the past 2 decades. All right. So on the right, I show you the recent 2 years. All right, the contribution. So you say, what's the difference? Actually, at the bottom, I show you the average of the contribution from these 4 components of the GDP growth. From 1984 to 2019, the consumption contribution is 1.9%. Usually is the largest. Not only is the largest component, is also the largest component in terms of the GDP growth. And private investment is 0.7%. And net export, negative 0.1%. And government spending in the past 2 decades, on average, is 0.3%. All right. And right now, let's just look at the past 2 years. So we can see consumption 1.8%, very similar to the past average. Private investment 0.6%, very similar. Net export negative 0.1%, very similar. But government spending, we had 0.7%, much higher than the historical average. So what's that? You guys probably remember we passed this Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act. I think a lot of infrastructural investment are very necessary to our country. However, we need to think about its impact. So please go to the next slide.
Dr. Yu, one
Yes.
quick question on that slide, though. When you're referring to government, are we considering all levels of government consumption at the federal, state, and the local level?
Yes. So this is the old level of government spending. However, this doesn't include the so-called transfer payment. So if government spending goes through some kind of a social security unemployment, that belong to the consumption part. So this is a government direct spending or investment. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So here I show you this very, very interesting chart. Not a lot of people talk about this. So in this chart, I show you this correlation. Each blue dot represents a year. And this is basically over the past 6 decades. So the horizontal axis is the federal budget deficit as a percentage of our GDP in that year. And the vertical axis is the unemployment rate in that year. So basically, you see, I had this green circle. So basically, that is the negative correlation. So what does that mean? It means when the economy is doing well, unemployment rate is low, you can see is like in the right bottom corner. So when economy is growing very well, business pay more tax. So government had more tax revenue, right? So basically government usually could even run the budget surplus. When the economy was not doing well, when the economy was in a recession, this is what happened in that left upper corner of this green circle. For example, you can see 2009, 2011, 2012, 2010, during the Great Recession area. During the recession years, the government revenue declined. And at the same time, government need to spend a lot of money on unemployment insurance transfer, something like that. So usually we run the much larger deficit during this recession year. So that is understandable. However, outside this green circle, you can see in recent year, we had this kind of very unusual correlation. So you can see on the left top, 2020, that is COVID year. That is very unusual. And I think we understand that. And going to be lower, 2021. So at that time, we are already coming out of COVID, but we still spent a lot of money, all right? And at the same time, with this very extraordinary expansionary monetary policy, zero interest rate, QE, so that is why we see this dramatic inflation. All right. So right now, over the past 2 years, we have started to use the kind of tightening monetary policy, rising the interest rate. So basically, we see the reduced inflation rate. All right. However, so you can see here, right now, 2022, 2023, 2024, we had very low unemployment rate. Basically, it's a full employment situation. However, we are still running a very huge budget deficit. So that is the problem. Okay, so we need to face this. And Fran and Mark will talk about this more in detail later on. Okay, so go next. Yeah. So here, basically, we are predicting the continued growth of the U.S. economy, but with the increased uncertainty in the second Trump administration. So you guys probably heard Trump administration is going to do a lot of change over the next 4 years. And when we talk about uncertainty, it's not just downside risk. I need to say there might be upside risk. For example, here, the first one I think I focus the most is the deregulation. So we can talk about how the long-term problem of the deregulation. However, in the short term, the deregulation might unleash a lot of business dynamism. So I think deregulation might bring us some kind of upside risk, meaning higher GDP growth. And tax cut. So tax cut, we need to think about some kind of extended tax. I think Fran and Mark will talk about more because that related to the DOGE, how much we can cut government spending. If we cannot do both, then that budget deficit problem I show you in the previous slides will continue. Energy policy. So I think basically it is positive on the GDP growth. However, people are uncertain how much oil production we can produce more, because right now United States is already the #1 country in terms of oil production. And tariff and trade policy, that's the largest uncertainty people are all talking about. And Trump, President Trump didn't announce the tariff on his first day, but he said he might impose a tariff on February 1st. So we will see. And then finally, deportation, immigration policy is still remain to be seen. But things like the first year, the Trump administration is going to deport the immigrant with the criminal records. So all in all, we are more conservative. We are forecasting slower GDP growth over 2025. And then in 2026, we're going to go back to the normal growth range. Next. All right. So here I show you interest rate. So in this chart, the blue line is the federal funds rate, short-term overnight interest rate, and red color is the 10-year treasury yield. So last time in our presentation, we talk about this kind of concept, the era of the low rate. is over. All right, so that can see from this blue line. However, I think right now the market, the Wall Street started to realize, this kind of change will reflect to the whole term premium of the interest rate. And then right now we are seeing the 10-year Treasury yield kind of started to go up. And it creates some kind of panic in the financial market, but I don't think we need to be panicking at all because this is very natural. So while we are forecasting the federal funds rate this year will be around 4.3%, next year 4.1%. 10-year Treasury yield this year 4.6%, next year 4.4%. So I think we should not expect whether it's a short-term or long-term yield below 4%. Yeah, given the situation we are talking about is kind of a high budget deficit, usually inflation will be higher and then it will reflect on this interest rate. So next, please. So here, this is inflation. So the red line is the CPI core inflation rate and the blue line is the CPI headline inflation rate. So we can see in the recent months, the headline inflation rate revert and it started to rise. So basically, one of the reasons is what I just showed you before. We are still running huge budget deficit. We are still running this dramatic expansionary fiscal policy. Even we had very low unemployment rate. So with that, you cannot achieve this 2% inflation rate by the Fed easily. Yeah. So we are forecasting with different kind of CPI, PCE inflation rate. Usually you can see over these 2 years, it will be around 2%, 3% range. Yeah. Next. So finally, this is the chart. It's very interesting. The chart from San Francisco Federal Reserve. On the left, this is the contribution to the PCE inflation rate year over year. So here in the middle, on the left chart, you can see this blue bar. So that is the inflation rate contribute from food and energy, right? These usually are very volatile. So basically, it contribute a lot during 2021, 2022 period, and then it disappeared. All right. And then in the middle, you see this yellow bar. That is the so-called core goods. So basically, it's the inflation coming from the goods side. So basically, remember during that time period, COVID-19, supply chain disruption, all those kind of things coming from that period. And then green bar, this is the majority contribution of the inflation rate. And you can see it is very persistent. And even at this moment, it's still the largest contribution to the inflation rate. And then the bottom, this dark blue is the housing. So basically, we can see in the past year or two, the major source of our inflation actually coming from housing and services, not goods. And then if we look at 2018, 2019, because previously we are talking about tariff, indeed, a lot of people are very concerned about how tariff will cause higher inflation. But if we look at 2018, 2019, at that time, Trump administration imposed a tariff in China, we didn't see a lot of inflation coming from the goods side. And on the right, we can look at the breakdown of the detail of this service inflation. So we had a healthcare, financial insurance, food service and accommodation, transportation service, other services. They are still very stubborn and persistent over the past 2 years. So actually, I think previously I talked about this deregulation, how it will had a positive impact the GDP growth on the productivity, but also I think it might have some kind of positive impact in terms of reducing the inflation coming from this services sector. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. That last slide was really fascinating to see visually and to consider, as you're saying, what deregulation could do for services and not just focus on the tariffs and goods, but also appreciate the high level look at the macroeconomics, what's going on in the country, what's going on with GDP as we're looking nationwide. And now we'd like to take a look at locally what is going on and how it's impacting local governments. And with that, I'd like to invite Mark Bryson, please.
Hi. This slide here is a breakdown of the December CPIU inflation rate. And William has already touched on this in his earlier slides, where he talked about what's driving inflation right now, which is high costs of housing and high costs of services. And you can see, in fact, for instance, gasoline is actually down. If you get down to the bottom, though, you see the higher rates. Transportation services. Well, what is transportation services? Transportation services is motor vehicle repairs and maintenance, insurance, motor vehicle insurance, airline fares, and car and truck rentals. And then also you see the shelter component, which is rents, and then what they call homeowners equivalents of rents, where they don't use the mortgage payment, but say instead, what would the amount a homeowner would pay to live in a home that they own? And then property and casualty insurance. And so this has become more important to look at these components when you're thinking about sales tax policy and sales tax revenue. You have to understand that these different components are growing and contracting at different rates. So if I could have the next slide, please. So our model, we had disinflation. What happened? 10 years prior to the pandemic in 2020, California statewide sales tax grew at an annual rate of between 4 and 4.5%. Then with recovery in mid-2021, inflation rose to a peak in June of 2022 to 9.1%. Then the second half of 2022 through 2023, we experienced disinflation, with inflation stabilizing between 3 and 4% in 2024. And as William said, we're expecting between 2 and 3% in the next couple of years. So our sales tax forecast, we were expecting that we'd begin to see statewide trends toward more historical growth, like between 2 and 3% in the middle of 2024. It didn't happen. In 2021, we had 0.7% statewide growth in sales tax revenue in California. In quarter two of 24, we had minus 1.7%. And in 2024 Q3, we had minus 4.2% growth over the same quarter in the prior year. And so we had to look at our model and say, what's happened here? What's different about where we are now compared to the 10 years prior to the pandemic? So if I could have the next slide, please. And this just shows the declines. Basically, you can see where sales tax peaked in 2022 and has declined since then, not only on a nominal basis, but also on a real adjusted for inflation basis. And you can see that it's off by a couple of percentage points and over 8% when you adjust for inflation. So we're trying to understand why this is happening. The economy is healthy, and people have income. Why is this happening to sales tax revenues? So if we could have the next slide, please. And this is the model we came up with. We call it headwinds model, basically. And what we're seeing, and William also touched on some of this, one thing we're seeing is a tremendous shift away from consumer spending from goods to services. Now, this is important in states like California, Arizona, Colorado, where the sales tax is based on tangible goods mostly, and not so much on services. And so that shift is something that legislators are going to have to consider when they look at sales tax laws and policies going forward. We're also seeing some increases in unemployment in California, I know. And of course, William touched on higher costs of housing. We all know that healthcare is expensive and that education is expensive, and there's a lot of student debt associated with that. Higher costs of insurance, we're all very aware of that, especially with the LA fires. And in fact, those fires may be affecting insurance rates all across the country. We all know that groceries cost more and electricity is costing more. One, because there's higher demand, and that's due to the fact that with a warmer climate, it takes a lot of electricity to cool things down. Another thing is AI, by the way, is driving a demand for electricity. It takes a lot of electricity to drive a data center. And then higher temperatures, we just spoke to, and drought is also a problem. As you could see, it was a problem for the wildfires, but it's also a problem in terms of agriculture here in California, and I'm sure across the country. Fran, you have any comments on these headwinds?
Yeah, I think these are really quite relevant and in things we continue to look at and monitor, and I think we're going to continue to see this get more severe. I mean, a good example in California right now, it's warm and sunny and there's no rain or snow, but in South Carolina on the beach, it's literally snowing as this week and things of this nature. So we're going to have these kind of problems continue. The other thing I think that's interesting is, consumers are really having a hard time getting their hands around where we are in the economy. I think price levels, frankly, are most important to consumers rather than the inflation numbers. I think that's more relatable. Since 2020, we've seen the CPI for food prices going up about 26% since the pandemic. Mark mentioned earlier, gas prices rising and falling, and that's going to continue. So that's an important impact on revenues and costs and how people feel. New and used cars are about 20% more expensive than they were in 2020. So these price increases over time really weigh on people, especially in the lower and middle income classes. I think the other thing that's interesting is there's a lot of people who have gotten raises because their sectors are doing well, but so they're outpacing the costs that are before them, but other sectors they're not. So some people may be doing better than others in terms of revenues, in terms of salaries that will help them counterbalance this. So I think it's going to be a difficult thing for most people. They're going to be most focused on the price of goods rather than the inflationary numbers. And I think it's going to be hard for people to shake off, the severities of the pandemic. We see more borrowing to keep up with costs. So all of those things are weighing on the general public who may not be as focused on these things, and they need to be considered in this as well.
I was going to share anecdotally. Last week, I bought 18 eggs, didn't check what the price was, went up right to the cash register, and it rang up to $19.
Wow.
So those were very precious eggs, and I wanted to make sure the entire family enjoyed every single egg, given they were more than $1. But thank you for that. Headwind seems to be an understatement, and this seems to be quite the uphill climb. And I'm interested to see what you have to share next, Mark.
If we could have the next slide, please. This is an example of one of the big headwinds we were talking about. This shows percentage growth, personal consumption expenditures broken down between goods and services. And you can see that, they were pretty close. And then we had the pandemic. Then you had a surge in consumption of goods when everybody was stuck at home and shopping online. And then they came back in line again. But since the beginning of 23, there's been a divergence and a big consumer shift. Right now, in November, consumption of services grew at twice the rate of consumption of goods. And so again, for those states like California, Colorado, Arizona, and other states whose sales tax laws are focused on the sale of goods, they maybe need to reconsider how that is being computed. If we could have the next slide, please. I think, Rochelle, it's time to talk about federal policy.
Thanks, Mark. I think there are a lot of unknowns right now as we're just into our first week of the new administration, what to expect. We did see some executive orders, but still unsure what this will mean for us at the local level. I know one of the questions that we received from a participant today was, what does this mean for local governments and how will it impact our ability to get new sources of funds? And that I don't know how to answer that question, but what I do know is despite what happens at the federal level, and wearing my former mayor and former council member hat on, is that our sources of fund at the local level differ. We know that from state to state, from county to county. And at the same time, there's still a demand for what we need at the local level. We always look towards the federal government and the state government for what our fair share is and what we can actually draw down from those levels of government. But at the local level, we're still having to rethink things. We know, and I know Fran and Mark can speak to this, we have a lot of local city governments in California that are trying to maximize their sales tax. How do we get more sources of funds or higher percentage of funding for the local level and for us at cities? Not all cities have been successful with that, but are there other ways to diversify what our general fund looks like and what other, again, some of our funding looks like? And that's still a question that as local leaders, as local city staff, that we have to learn from other cities, learn from how others are able to diversify those funds, and again, maximize what can come at the local level. Fran, did you want to add on anything on this?
No, I think you did a great job, Rochelle, summing it up. I think one, to your point, I think we're still waiting to see what the federal government may do and how they may provide the funding for, especially at the local level. One of the things we've heard is that they may go more, the Trump administration may lean more towards block grant funding as an example. So a bit more of a competitive nature for cities and in special districts and counties to consider. So that may make it a little bit differently. There will be funding. I think the new administration recognizes the importance of local governments as a vital partner between the state, local, and federal levels. So I think that's a positive. But I think we're going to have to be creative. I also think cities need to be very proactive in how they tax themselves or consider policies around revenues, because things are changing rapidly, as we've been talking about today. So a proactive nature is really important. I also encourage local leaders to really spend time with their city associations or their county associations and collaborate on policy going forward. That's something, frankly, we're being drawn into in quite a few locations right now as an advisor. So something for you to think about.
I think that's an important point, Fran, regarding the associations, understanding what's coming down the pike, to understanding what you might be eligible for and how to make sure you're prepared for it. I know that with different administrations, we've seen, are you shovel ready? Are you ready to go? So do you have those things in place, understanding as to whether it's a block grant or other types of funding is coming down the pike? So leveraging your local associations, I think, is going to be very key during this critical time. So thank you on that, Fran. Can we have the next slide, please? I think, Mark, we're going to hand this off to you first.
Okay. This is a slide provided by Wells Fargo that basically looked at some of the fiscal impacts of some of President Trump's proposals. And I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into those numbers, but just understand that, for instance, extending and modifying the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's a $5.3 trillion cost. And so the negative numbers represent sources of expenditures. And then at the bottom, you have the green, which is the positive numbers, which are revenue sources. For instance, establish a universal baseline tariff and additional tariffs. That's 2.7 trillion. The difficult part about this, and this is all speculative. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. But all of these, if you look at the bottom line, actually add to the deficit. And what I wanted to talk about very briefly is how big the deficit is and what that really means. And so as of January 25th, 2025, the U.S. national debt is estimated to be $36 trillion. And we're paying $1 trillion annually of interest on that debt, the people that hold federal debt, T-bills and such. Now, how much is $1 trillion? Well, it's $1 million. And so how much is that? Well, when I became interested in astronomy a few years ago, I decided, I'm trying to understand these huge numbers. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write out the numbers 1 to 1 million so I can actually get a feel for how big 1 million is. But before I did that, I calculated, I said, okay, let's say it's going to be an average of 6 seconds to write each number because some of them get quite long and I'll be taking breaks, etc. If I work out at 40 hours a week, how long will it take me to write out the numbers 1 to 1 million? And the answer is 9.5 months. So a million, that's a trillion. I asked AI this morning, so at 6 seconds each, how long would it take me to write the numbers 1 to 1 trillion? That's 800,000 years.
Wow.
And
That's-
then writing out the numbers 1 to 36 trillion, which is our national debt, that would take me, if I worked at it for 40 hours a week, it would take me 28.8 million years. So
That is fascinating, Mark.
so
I can't even put my head around that. And I think the important question is, what number were you able to write up to?
I never started because I thought, well, I'm sorry, I don't have 9.5 months right now to dedicate to this project. Perhaps if I get bored in retirement, I'll take it on.
What a way to illustrate that. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you to AI for calculating those numbers so fast.
So the point of this is it will take a sustained, multifaceted effort over many years to make a significant a dent in this massive debt. And sacrifices and compromises are going to have to be made by everybody involved.
Yeah,
Fran?
just to add to it, I think Mark really laid that out in a quite an amazingly visual way. And I think to Mark's point, the 36 trillion has built up over many decades, and it's going to continue for many decades ahead. So politically, we're going to have to work together. It's not going to be solved in this current administration as it was in the past or perhaps the future. But collaboration is going to be more vital for this country's viability economically than ever before. And I think hopefully this helps illustrate that point.
Thank you both. Maybe the next slide, please. So impacts of AI, robotics, and autonomous vehicles. I know we've been covering this topic for these last few webinars, but it continues to be top of mind as it relates to what we do every day and also what it means to local government. If we can have the next slide, please.
Well, Mark, would you like me to start off and then?
Please, Fran.
Yeah, so I think this is meant to kind of paint a picture similar to Mark's with the large numbers. Our country has faced a lot of transition over time. There's a big transition from horse and buggies to when trains and locomotives took place, then to automobiles, highways, computers, as you can see here. I think AI is likely the next transformation for us, and that's something we have to grapple with and address as we look at the economy. And really, what is AI, and how do we best utilize it and benefit from it? And I think you'll see on the slide, it's likely to create new jobs in fields like AI development, data science, robotics. You heard Mark utilizing it for this presentation. I know we use it for analytic work. It's really a great tool. But is it a standalone service? Perhaps not. But it could, in fact, have impacts to the economy and employment where it could displace workers in some sectors, especially where you have a lot of routine and repetitive tasks, whether it's stocking goods in a warehouse or potentially even in restaurants where you can make an order and it'll be delivered. There's a lot of degrees like that, staffing jobs, things of that may be places where AI can replace human people doing the work. So that's something that's really important to consider. It can be used and it'll impact businesses, governments, and other organizations. Autonomous vehicles is another question we hear a lot. How will that impact us? I think that's something that will have a global impact over time, but we're not going to see a lot of that really for several years ahead. But robotics is another area where jobs will be lost, and that's driven by a lot of the AI engine as well. So I think we're going to see this coming at us hard and fast, and it's something we need to prepare for. We should, it has to be monitored carefully. It's a great tool, but we also need to be sensitive that it could have some unintended consequences as well. But it's very real. It's here. I know Mark and I have talked about this. Some of the large tech companies are hiring massive salespeople to go out and help sell the tool to businesses. So it's here and it's real.
Mark or Dr. Yu, either of you want to comment on this?
William?
Okay. Yes, I fully agree with a friend. Yeah, AI is very important. It's probably the most important thing in the coming decades. In Anderson School, we had professor, researcher coming to talk about all kinds of topics. And I can tell you it's 80%, 90%, we are all talking about AI. How does AI impact our business practice, whatsoever jobs? So really, yeah, we need to prepare for that big change coming.
Thanks, William. Mark?
If we could see the next slide, we can look at that. So here's a study that was done about what the AI automation risk, if you will, is to certain professions. And the red numbers over on the right are the important part. And in a conversation with Dr. Yu recently, he made a very important point, which is with the adoption of all technologies, there's what he called an inflection point, which is when you go from early adopters to everybody kind of getting on board and getting with the program. And so we don't know exactly when that's going to be. I think with AI, it's going to be sooner rather than later. I think with autonomous vehicles, it's going to be a little further out because they're still perfecting that technology. I saw an article that talked about Tesla recently making a big improvement that their vehicle can go 700 something miles without having a human intervene. In other words, without having an accident. But the average human can go 650,000 miles without having an accident. So there's still a way for that technology to go before we're fully reliant on autonomous vehicles. But AI is coming now. Like as Fran pointed out, Salesforce has a new Agentforce product that they're bringing out in February. It's basically an autonomous agent, which is basically a worker that can make decisions and do work. And they're hiring 2,000. They're hiring 2,000 people to sell those. So that we're going to begin seeing that impact in this coming year. If we could see the next slide, please. So Rochelle, how about some recommendations?
Thanks, Mark. I wish I could personally give some recommendations, but thank you that we were able to get a source of Gemini Advanced on some of these recommendations for state and local government. One thing I do know is that a lot of local governments are asking, how can this work for us? How do we apply it? I know we did get a question from Berkeley, California, asking about more of AI applications and how a city might use them. There aren't specific programs or ways to use them that I think we're in the position to recommend. However, this summary here that's on this slide is very helpful as we think about local governments and how to use those. And I did have a previous life with workforce development and still am involved in some ways. And focusing on the investment of education and training is going to be extremely important as we're looking at AI. Partner with educational institutions, workforce development entities to offer accessible AI-related training. I do know that even with technology at one point, just how to use computers, there was a lot of questions how to reskill our existing workforce. And that's going to be necessary at this point also as it relates to AI. That relates to that next bullet point of retaining workers and targeting those that are most at risk. Apprenticeships are going to be extremely important. I know those are starting. I'm starting to see those in many different places. But how do we fund it? What are the financial aids and incentives? I think we're going to have to keep a lookout for that. And it would be great if some of the local governments that are attending today and staff and elected officials, if you are seeing some of those financial aids and incentives on AI-related education, to share those with us so we can share with others, that would be fantastic. The other two major bullet points here are foster innovation. Create spaces, and this is on the next item too, but I think Dr. Yu shared this, is that we need to embrace it. Mark was talking about too, and so as Fran is, it is coming. How do we adapt to it? How do we ensure that we're growing with it? So create those spaces, encourage new AI businesses, and strengthen the safety net to enhance unemployment benefits for displaced workers, which I know will be a challenge, and we're going to be faced with that soon enough. And how do we help those impacted businesses make those transitions? Next slide, please. And that actually brings us to the end of our webinar, but we do know we have some questions and we want to make sure that we address those. And we do have some questions that came in from participants or attendees to this webinar, and I'll go through some of those. But before we do that, I just wanted to highlight some of these key takeaways. There will be continued growth in the U.S. economy with increased uncertainties, however, with the new administration. With a large federal budget deficit and seeing that $36 trillion number and understanding what a trillion can be, thanks to Mark and his AI calculations. But with that federal budget deficit, inflation and interest rates are expected to remain elevated. And unfortunately, we're not expecting typical growth in sales revenues. And this can differ from state to state, obviously in different industries. But as we're seeing as a trend, we're not expected to see typical growth rates in the same pattern. And lastly, AI, robotics, and autonomous vehicles. If you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. Again, you've heard it time and time again. It is coming. How do we adjust to it? How do we ensure that we are moving along with how technology is progressing? So, with those takeaways, I'd like us to jump into some of our questions. I know we do have some time for it. Thank you again to those that submitted questions. We are able to address some of them as they relate to local funding at city government, also AI and AI applications. I think I'd like to move to a question from Eaton, Ohio, and this has to do with rural areas and the pressures of housing costs. And Dr. Yu, if you can help us address that and understanding that housing and population growth in rural areas, they're different from what's happening in the metropolitan areas. How can we see housing cost pressures impact the rural areas?
Yes, I can say something. So over the past 25 years, as I mentioned before, we had this extraordinary era of low interest rate, and that kind of low interest rate eventually dry up the housing price. So in the early 20 years, it dry out the housing price in bi-coastal area, East Coast, West Coast. However, after COVID, I think this kind of asset bubble spread to the rest of the country. So right now, everybody feel the pain of housing costs really high. And then right now, mortgage rate is also very high. So really, it is very difficult to live in the urban area, in the suburban area. So rural area, I think cost of living is relatively cheap compared to this municipal area. So indeed, I think another important change is this remote work with this kind of side impact from the COVID era. So I think rural area might have some kind of benefit because of relative cost, low cost of living, but I think the key factor is how far it is close to the urban suburban area. If this rural area is closer to this metropolitan area, I think it will definitely benefit. But if it is in very far distant area, I think because of the lack of the scale, lack of urban amenity, I think we don't expect it had a very dramatic growth in the coming year and decades.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Yu. One other question that had come from Berea, Kentucky that's somewhat related is the question of housing and using manufactured mobile homes and using that for housing market. And I just wanted to relay it somewhat. What is different about rural areas that's very obvious about some of the metropolitan areas is just land and space. So clearly there might be an opportunity for manufactured housing to come into play more so, especially as it relates to costs and as it relates to rural areas. And so I think our last question that we can entertain today is dealing with a question from Los Angeles, which is very apt in asking about what the net changes from previous forecast predictions for California and Los Angeles that may be attributed to the wildfires, and understand that we don't have definite numbers at this point, but we do have some facts and statistics that we can refer to. I'm going to ask if Mark can start us off by answering that question, please.
So I think when we talk about the recent wildfires in Los Angeles County, we should start by discussing the human costs before we get into the dollars. And between 20 and 30 people lost their lives, and many people were directly impacted, over 100,000 that lost their homes, including our esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Jerry Nicholsberg of the Anderson Forecast. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that before we talk a lot of numbers. Looking at sales tax revenues, which is what I do, We can look back on the Tubbs fire of 2017 that impacted Santa Rosa. That was actually a very devastating fire for that city. Basically, about 4.2 of their total population, 4.2% of their total population was impacted directly by the fire. And about 5% of the city's structures were destroyed. That gives you some scale in terms of Los Angeles County. With 150,000 people being directly impacted, that's only 1.5% of the population. And in terms of structures destroyed, about 12,000 is the estimate. That's 1.2% of the total structures. What that means is that in terms of sales tax revenue, what we learned from the Tubbs fire is that you have additional capture. You lose some of the tourism, for instance, but you have additional capture from rescue workers, first responders, construction workers, people involved in putting out the fires and involved in restoration efforts, clearing away debris, etc. That actually generates additional revenue to make up for some of the revenue that is lost. And so at the end of the year, when we looked at Santa Rosa, they actually didn't have a different trajectory on their sales tax growth than other surrounding cities that we looked at that had no impact from the fire. So we're not really going to revise our sales tax forecast based on the fire's impact. William, could you talk about the broader economic impact?
So based on our estimation, based on the Cal Fire, right now we have 15,000 structures being destroyed. So based on this and based on the median household home price, we estimate the total insured capital loss to be about 60 to 70 billion dollars. And beyond that, if we include all the uninsured capital loss or some kind of public infrastructure, environmental cleanup costs, it could be up to 90 billion to 150 billion dollars in terms of this kind of capital loss. So it's huge, really huge. And I would like to add to what Mark said about the local government budget. Indeed, what we found in the literature is the tax revenue actually increased, like what Mark was talking about, sales tax increase. But the other thing is actually is very surprising. What we found is the property tax also increased. So what's going on here? Because I think it's very unique for California because we had Prop 13 and this wildfire actually increased the turnover of home ownership. And then this kind of new market price keep in. So we can see the property tax increase as well in the following years. However, we need to understand the local government also will increase a lot of expenditure dealing with this wildfire and the potential risk. So what happened is the local budget actually will worsen, not surprising, after the wildfire. And finally, I want to say this because California had this kind of insurance problem. So after the Los Angeles wildfire, we are expecting the insurance premium will continue to rise for whole California residents. So that means our cost of living will even be higher.
Yeah, unfortunately, William, I know that personally. I live right next to the Altadena community, and we were evacuated for at least 5 to 6 days. But what we had experienced, which we are hearing so many stories about right now, is just insurance alone. I know we had our insurance canceled, our house insurance canceled, and we scrambled to find it. And it increased by 3 times just in a matter of what we were paying the year before to where we were able to finally secure coverage. So we're seeing a lot of that now. We're also seeing how the fires have impact rent, housing, and I think property tax, it will be yet to see on that, but insurance most definitely. So thank you, Mark and William, for your insights on that. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. I know we had some questions that we were able to address throughout the presentation itself. And if there are other questions, feel free to submit it to Avenue Insights and Analytics. We'd be happy to take a look at those and answer for you. But again, thank you on behalf of UCLA Anderson Forecast and Avenue Insights and Analytics for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at the next Economic Forecast webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.